This is Canadian MGTOW, having fun, and not giving a shit. Welcome to another installment of This Week in Devolution. My first story covers a celebrity death that I actually gave a shit about. Chester Bennington, the lead singer of Linkin Park, hung himself on July 20th. His music was there for me during my recovery from divorce. I was totally appalled at a lot of social media responses which essentially threw him under the bus. There is a middle-aged male suicide epidemic in this country that no one cares about, except in that it impacts women financially. Cries of poor wife and his poor kids. This is a typical response to men's mental health issues. You don't blame cancer victims for dying, do you? Then stop blaming male suicide victims. Emphasis on male suicide, because I did not see this kind of response when a female celebrity commits suicide. Instead, it is typically a conversation about her struggles, and the broader topic of mental illness. For those unconvinced and still hold the view that suicide is selfish and weak, please listen to the following text which I found best describes suicide. The so-called psychotically depressed person who tries to kill himself doesn't do so out of quote, helplessness, or any abstract conviction that life's assets and debits do not square, and surely not because death suddenly becomes appealing. The person in whom its agony reaches a certain unendurable level will kill himself the same way a trapped person will eventually jump from the window of a burning tower. Make no mistake about people who leap from burning windows. Their terror of falling from a great height is still just as great as it would be for you or me standing speculatively at the same window just checking out the view. In other words, the fear of falling remains a constant. The variable here is the other terror, the fire's flames. When the fire gets close enough, falling to death becomes the slightly less terrible of two terrors. It's not describing the fall. It's the terror of the flames. And yet nobody down on the sidewalk, looking up and yelling, "Don't," and "Hang on," can understand the jump. Not really. You'd have to have personally been trapped and felt the flames to really understand a terror way beyond falling. My second story is from Winnipeg, Manitoba in Canada. A woman was sentenced to just 8.5 years in prison for what Huffington Post called, hiding 6 dead babies. The woman, Andrea Giesbrecht, hid the remains of 6 infants in a rented storage locker in plastic bins. These were not miscarriages, but newly delivered infants. She knew she had medical options and chose not to access them. The judge noted that Giesbrecht has not shown remorse or taken any responsibility for her actions. The infants, 5 male and 1 female, were likely to have been born alive, he wrote. The Crown, otherwise known as the prosecution to my American friends, had pushed for 11 years, which in itself is too low in my opinion. What would she have had to do to actually get the 11 years? The trial heard that Giesbrecht had 10 therapeutic abortions between 1994 and 2011. A number confirmed by her lawyer. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to guess what the sentencing would be if it had been the husband who killed all 6 infants. These infants were the most vulnerable members of society. Perhaps this is just the result of a society in which abortions are readily available. A lot of times these issues will get drowned out because of highly public fighting between men's rights activists and feminists, which winds up overshadowing the legitimate concerns that many MRAs have. The sentencing gap should be a large issue not only for men's rights activists, but for feminists. It is a clear example of how our justice system treats women as if they have less agency and are thus less accountable for their actions. But if you're a feminist, it's much easier to sit back, because after all, this might devalue your victim card. Not to mention what I would deem a perk for women in the justice system. I'll be back after a word from my sponsor.
This flat tire needs a man. But when there's no man around, when there's no man around, Goodyear should be. Why? Watch this. New Goodyear Double Eagle carries its own spare inside. Lifeguard safety spare. A tire in a tire. Keeps on going. Next time, give her a second chance.
Speaking of hiding things, the next story calls out another inconvenient truth which feminists either hide or are ignorantly unaware of, or both. The popular feminist narrative would have you believe that porn is largely consumed by men, and that depictions of violent, or at least rough, sex would be a primarily male-dominated interest. They define pornography as the graphic sexually explicit subordination of women through pictures or words. Blah, blah, blah. Well, now a Google researcher has come across something interesting. This is untrue, states researcher Seth Stevens Davidowitz, who says that porn featuring violence against women is significantly more popular among women compared to men. His findings might explain the popularity of the BDSM-heavy 50 Shades of Grey series of novels among female readers. Google data proves that most Americans lie about their sexual preferences. The researcher and author of Everybody Lies asserts that more women enjoy the genre compared to male porn watchers, despite common sense and politically correct claims to the contrary. Facts over feels, ladies. Facts over feels. Now before you cast Seth as some hero for bringing this out, he goes on to say, as any mangina would,
porn featuring violence against women is also extremely popular among women. I hate saying that because misogynists seem to love this fact.
He also added,
fantasy life isn't always politically correct. The rate at which women watch violent porn is roughly the same in every part of the world. It isn't correlated with how women are treated.
One last statistical tidbit. Google searches for how to breastfeed a baby are pretty consistent around the world, except for India. In India the searches are evenly split between breastfeeding a baby and breastfeeding a husband. Speaking of feminist narratives, this next story tries to shame the truth. A writer for Allure magazine, an American women's beauty magazine, recently penned an article titled, "This study about which types of women's bodies men prefer is pointless and irresponsible." The writer, Rosemary Donahue, took offense to the study's quotes, such as, "Aspects of the female body may be attractive because they signal evolutionary fitness. Greater body fatness might reflect greater potential to survive famines, but individuals carrying larger fat stores may have poor health and lower fertility in non-famine conditions." The main point of the study was what men preferred:
rating women based on their attractiveness and nothing else, in a system where aesthetic is the only measure of worth. Though this is arguably the point of the study, normalization of things like this is also the reason we're in this mess.
Perhaps I could refer her to an OkCupid study in which it was shown women on the website rated 80% of the men as below average. The article blathers on and is fixated on weight and BMI numbers. The article entirely skips one aspect that my misogynistic heteronormative brain takes into account when rating women's bodies, and that is this: the face. The face is part of the body, and if she has the meanest face in town, it simply doesn't matter if the rest of her body is a 10. My grocery store charges me 5 cents per bag, and hiding her head in a bag is simply not worth the expense. She goes on to say that we know more or less what society thinks men like because the ideal woman is plastered all over the place. and we fight those beauty standards every day by asking for more diversity and inclusion in the fashion and beauty realms. I would argue it is the other way around. In my lifetime there has never been more non-white models in advertising than there is now, and sorry, but some of them simply do not turn my crank. Grace Jones anyone? And don't get me started on plus-sized models. Rosemary, the writer, not the Herb, goes on to recount a horror story of how Jennifer Lawrence was recently told by Sharon Tate's own sister that she wasn't pretty enough to play Tate for an upcoming movie project. Sharon Tate, for those of you who do not know, is famous for being a Hollywood star who was murdered by members of Charles Manson's family in 1969. Putting her picture next to Jennifer's, I can honestly say Tate was better looking. And if it is anyone who should have a say in who plays her in a movie, it should be her own family, namely her sister in this case. Other articles by Rosemary include:
I got engaged via text message, and it was perfect. A non-exhaustive list of all the things I used to do to try to become more beautiful. How my body dysmorphia started an online shopping addiction. How I learned to love my high-maintenance self. Why I've stopped saying sorry to my partner.
Rosemary describes herself as writer and editor living in Brooklyn, New York. I love my dogs more than I love most people.
When do I get to speak? I demand equality of outcome.
Shut your hole.